In the history of naval warfare, there are ships that transcend their steel and rivets, becoming more than weapons of war. They evolve into symbols of ambition, of national pride, of both triumph and tragedy. Among these giants, none looms larger than the Japanese battleship Yamato. She was the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed battleship ever built, a floating fortress designed to embody the might of the Empire of Japan and to strike awe into friend and foe alike. To the Japanese people, Yamato was not merely a warship. She was a symbol of hope and resilience during one of the most turbulent eras in their history. To the world, she became both an engineering marvel and a reminder of how swiftly the tides of warfare can change. With her immense guns, capable of hurling shells the size of small cars across vast distances, and her crew of thousands, she represented the peak of battleship design. Yet, in her end, she also represented the fading twilight of the battleship era, overtaken by the rise of air power and the unforgiving logic of modern war. This is the story of Yamato, from her secretive conception and construction through her brief but dramatic service to her fiery end in the waters of the Pacific. It is a tale of human ambition, of technological achievement, and of sacrifice. To understand why Yamato was built, we must first step back into the turbulent decades between the two world wars. Japan had emerged from the early 20th century as a rising naval power. Its stunning victory over the Russian Empire in 1904 to 1905 had cemented its place as a formidable maritime nation. Yet, by the 1920s, the global balance of naval power was shifting. In an effort to prevent another ruinous arms race, the world's leading powers convened in Washington, D.C. in 1922. The result was the Washington Naval Treaty, which placed strict limits on the number and size of battleships that could be constructed. For Japan, the treaty was a bitter compromise. While the United States and Britain were allowed larger fleets, Japan was forced to accept a smaller ratio of capital ships, roughly 3 Japanese battleships for every 5 American or British counterparts. To many within the Imperial Japanese Navy, this felt like an insult, a denial of equal status among the great naval powers. This imbalance haunted Japanese naval planners. If war with the United States ever came, Japan would likely be outnumbered. The solution, they reasoned, was not to match the U.S. ship for ship, but to build vessels so powerful that each could defeat multiple opponents. From this philosophy was born the idea of the super battleship, a vessel so massive, so well armored, and so heavily armed that it could outfight any number of enemy ships. By the late 1930s, Japan had withdrawn from the naval treaties altogether. Freed from restrictions, Japanese engineers began work on their most ambitious project yet, a battleship of unprecedented size and power, one that would carry guns larger than anything the world had ever seen. This ship would become Yamato, named after the ancient Japanese province that symbolized the heart of the nation. The idea of a super battleship did not come about lightly. By the early 1930s, Japanese naval strategists knew that if their nation were ever to confront the United States in the Pacific, they would be fighting a numerically superior enemy. Their solution was a single guiding principle: qualitative superiority over quantitative inferiority. If Japan could not match America in numbers, then every Japanese battleship had to be stronger, faster, and more destructive than anything afloat elsewhere. In 1934, a secret program was initiated within the Imperial Japanese Navy, known simply as Project A-140. The goal was ambitious, even audacious, to design and build the largest battleship in history. Engineers at the Naval Technical Department began sketching concepts that dwarfed anything envisioned in the West. The most radical feature of these designs was the main battery. While most battleships of the era carried 14 or 16-inch guns, the Yamato class would mount massive 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever fitted to a warship. Each gun measured over 20 meters in length and weighed more than 150 tons. A single shell weighed nearly 1.5 tons, so heavy that a small truck would have struggled to carry it. Fired with immense charges of propellant, these shells could travel more than 25 miles, arcing across the horizon with devastating power. To withstand enemy fire, the designers encased the ship in armor thicker than any before it. Her main belt was up to 16 inches thick, forged to resist even the heaviest shells of American or British battleships. Her decks were layered with steel designed to protect against plunging fire and aerial bombs. Every detail spoke of an obsession with survivability in a duel against overwhelming odds. But the design posed immense challenges. Such a ship would displace over 70,000 tons when fully loaded, far larger than any dry dock in Japan could then accommodate. To build her, the Kure Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's premier shipyards, had to be significantly expanded. Giant cranes were erected, and a vast covered dock was constructed to hide the ship from aerial reconnaissance. Even the workers who toiled on her hull often did not know the ship's true dimensions. Secrecy was absolute. Construction of Yamato began in 1937 under a shroud of mystery. The slipway was enclosed beneath an enormous roof, making the entire process invisible from prying eyes. Thousands of laborers, engineers, and craftsmen worked in shifts, laying down the massive steel plates, welding the frames, and installing the gargantuan machinery that would drive the ship through the sea. Her propulsion system consisted of 12 compound boilers feeding 4 huge turbines, delivering 150,000 shaft horsepower to 4 bronze propellers. Despite her colossal size, this allowed Yamato to reach speeds of 27 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the main battle fleet. As the years passed, the great hull took shape. By the time she was ready for launch in December 1941, she had already become a legend whispered within naval circles. On the 16th of that month, just 9 days after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and plunged into war with the United States, Yamato slid down the ways into the waters of the inland sea. At that moment, she was the most powerful battleship in the world. Her fitting out continued through 1942. Turrets were mounted, secondary batteries installed, and radar equipment added. Her crew began training aboard, learning to handle the immense ship that was to be their home. For them, serving on Yamato was a profound honor. She was not just another ship, but the pride of the nation. By late 1941 and into 1942, as the Pacific War raged across vast distances, Yamato was officially commissioned into service. She was more than a warship, she was a symbol. For Japan, her towering presence represented strength, hope, and the promise that the empire could withstand even the mightiest adversaries. Technical characteristics. The Yamato was not simply a battleship, she was a floating fortress, a marvel of engineering pushed to the very limits of what was possible in the 1930s and 1940s. Every element of her design was built with one purpose in mind: to outgun and outlast any enemy ship afloat. Dimensions and displacement. At full load, Yamato displaced nearly 72,000 tons, making her the largest battleship ever constructed. Her length stretched to 263 meters, or nearly 862 feet, longer than 2 football fields placed end to end. She stood over 38 meters across at the beam, giving her a wide, stable platform for her enormous guns. Her draft, the depth below water, was nearly 11 meters, so deep that only a few harbors in Japan could accommodate her safely. Seen from the sea, Yamato was a towering silhouette, her massive hull cutting through the waves with an almost unnatural presence. To those who served on her, she felt less like a ship and more like a city afloat. Main armament. The heart of Yamato's power lay in her main battery, 946 centimeter, 18.1-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. Each gun was the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of firing a shell weighing up to 3,200 pounds, roughly the size of a small automobile. The explosive power of each shell was immense. A single hit could obliterate even the heaviest of enemy cruisers or tear through the thickest armor of rival battleships. The guns had a maximum range of over 25 miles, meaning Yamato could engage her opponents long before they could return fire. Yet such destructive power came with challenges. It took an entire team of men to load each shell, using hydraulic lifts and complex machinery. The roar of the guns was so great that it shook the entire ship, rattling dishes in the mess holes and leaving crewmen with ringing ears. Secondary armament and anti-aircraft weapons. Beyond her main guns, Yamato carried an array of secondary weapons. 12 6-1-inch guns in 4 triple turrets provide protection against cruisers and destroyers. In addition, she was bristling with anti-aircraft defenses. Initially, 24 127mm 5-inch dual-purpose guns and over 125mm automatic cannons. As the war dragged on and air attacks became the greatest threat, the number of anti-aircraft guns increased dramatically, though never enough to fully shield her from swarms of American aircraft. Armor protection. If her guns were her fists, her armor was her shield. The Yamato's protection was without equal. Her main belt armor was up to 16 inches thick, sloping inward to deflect incoming shells. The decks were layered with armor as thick as 9 inches to protect against aerial bombs and plunging fire. Her turrets were encased in walls of steel over 25 inches thick, making them almost impregnable. The philosophy was clear. Yamato was designed to take punishment from any battleship afloat and still remain in the fight. In theory, she could withstand multiple hits from American 16-inch shells, the heaviest guns her adversaries possessed. Propulsion and speed. Despite her size, Yamato was no sluggish behemoth. Her propulsion system was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering. 12 Kampen boilers, feeding steam to 4 turbines, producing an astonishing 150,000 shaft horsepower. This drove her 4 massive bronze propellers and allowed the ship to reach speeds of up to 27 knots, roughly 31 miles per hour. For a ship of her size, it was a remarkable feat, giving her the ability to maneuver with the fleet and reposition in battle when needed. Crew and life on board. A ship of such size required a vast crew. At full strength, Yamato carried nearly 3,300 officers and enlisted men. They lived and worked within the steel labyrinth of the ship, sleeping in cramped quarters deep inside the hull, eating in mess holes that could serve hundreds at a time, and standing long watches in the engine rooms, gun turrets, and command centers. For many sailors, life aboard Yamato was both an honor and a hardship. The honor came from serving on the Pride of the Fleet, the most famous warship in Japan. The hardship lay in the endless drills, the constant vigilance, and the knowledge that in war the ship would be a prime target for the enemy. Innovations. The Yamato also carried innovations ahead of her time. She was equipped with some of the earliest Japanese naval radar sets, though these lagged behind their American counterparts. Her fire control systems were among the most advanced in the world, capable of calculating firing solutions for her immense guns with precision. Her massive size even allowed her to carry reconnaissance aircraft, float planes launched by catapult and retrieved by crane that could spot targets and extend her reach far beyond the horizon. In every detail, the Yamato was designed to be invincible. Yet, as history would soon show, she was built for a kind of war that was already fading away. The age of the battleship was giving way to a new era, one dominated by the aircraft carrier and the power of air superiority. Commissioning into the fleet. On December 16, 1941, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamato was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The world had entered a new phase of war, and for Japan, Yamato represented the very peak of its naval ambitions. She became the flagship of the combined fleet, carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. To the officers and sailors who stepped aboard, serving on Yamato was considered the highest honor. Yet from the beginning, the ship's story was marked by caution. Because of her immense size and symbolic importance, the Navy leadership was hesitant to risk her in direct combat. Unlike other battleships, which were thrust into the early campaigns across the Pacific, Yamato spent much of her early career anchored in the protected waters of the inland sea, a silent giant held in reserve. Flagship of Admiral Yamamoto. In 1942, Yamato assumed her role as the command center of the Japanese fleet. From her heavily fortified bridge, Admiral Yamamoto directed operations across the Pacific. During the pivotal Battle of Midway in June 1942, Yamato was part of the Japanese fleet, though she remained far from the actual fighting. Her guns, capable of devastating entire battle lines, never fired a shot in that engagement. Instead, she lay hundreds of miles to the rear, guarding against a threat that never materialized. When news reached her decks that 4 Japanese carriers had been destroyed at Midway, the atmosphere aboard the great battleship turned somber. It was the first sign that Japan's naval supremacy was beginning to falter, and Yamato's role as a distant observer rather than an active combatant reflected a strategy increasingly cautious, almost fearful of risking the Navy's greatest treasure. Early sorties and transfers. Through 1942 and 1943, Yamato saw little direct action. She spent much of her time moving between anchorages in Japan's inland waters, occasionally making sorties to distant bases such as Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, the main forward base of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These voyages were long and tense as the Pacific had become increasingly dominated by American submarines and aircraft. In December 1943, during one such transfer, Yamato was torpedoed by the American submarine USS Skate. A single torpedo struck her on the starboard side, flooding compartments and killing dozens of crewmen. Though the damage was not fatal, it forced Yamato to withdraw for lengthy repairs. The incident was a stark reminder that even the mightiest battleship was not invincible, and that lurking beneath the waves, silent hunters could threaten even a fortress of steel. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. By mid-1944, the tide of war had shifted decisively against Japan. The United States, with its vast industrial power, was pressing westward across the Pacific. Aircraft carriers had become the dominant force at sea, and battleships like Yamato were increasingly relegated to supporting roles. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the scale of American aerial victories, Yamato sailed with the fleet but played little role in the fighting. Once again, her great guns remained silent. The battle was decided in the skies, where waves of Japanese aircraft were cut down by American carrier pilots. The days when battleships could dictate the outcome of naval wars were slipping away. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that Yamato finally entered the kind of battle for which she had been designed. Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history, a desperate Japanese attempt to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, sailed with a powerful center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita. As they steamed through the Sibuyan Sea, American aircraft swarmed overhead in relentless waves. Musashi bore the brunt of the attacks, struck repeatedly by bombs and torpedoes until she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. Yamato herself was hit but survived, her thick armor withstanding the punishment. She pressed on, eventually engaging American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar in one of the most dramatic clashes of the war. There, outnumbered and outgunned, a small group of American ships bravely charged at the Japanese fleet, launching torpedoes and aircraft in desperate defense. Despite Yamato's immense firepower, confusion and aggressive resistance forced Kurita to withdraw. For Yamato, the battle was both her greatest moment and a haunting sign of futility. Her guns had thundered in anger, but the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The Empire of Japan was in retreat, and the fate of its proudest warship was already being sealed. The twilight of the battleship. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was nearing its inevitable conclusion. Japan's empire had shrunk under the relentless advance of American forces. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy was shattered, its aircraft carriers sunk, its bases overrun, and its pilots and sailors worn down by years of attrition. In this desperate hour, Yamato remained one of the few symbols of strength still afloat. But even she, the largest battleship ever built, had no true place in a war now dominated by aircraft carriers and submarines. To many within Japan's high command, she was a relic, majestic, formidable, yet obsolete. Still, in the spring of 1945, as American forces landed on Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, the Navy resolved to commit Yamato to one final desperate mission. Operation Tengo. The plan was codenamed Operation Tengo. It was, in essence, a suicide mission. Yamato, escorted by a handful of light cruisers and destroyers, would sail from the inland sea south toward Okinawa. There, she was to beach herself on the shoreline and act as a stationary fortress, pouring fire from her massive guns against the American invasion fleet. Her crew knew that fuel was so scarce she had only enough for a one-way journey. They also knew that without air cover, she would almost certainly never reach her destination. Yet the order was given, and for the sailors of Yamato, there was no question of refusal. On April 6, 1945, she prepared for departure. On her decks, thousands of men readied themselves for a voyage from which they would not return. Many wrote farewell letters. Some wept, others stood stoically, knowing they had been chosen to give their lives for their country aboard the most famous ship in the Navy. The last voyage. On April 7th, Yamato and her small escort force steamed into the East China Sea. It was a clear morning, the sea calm beneath them. The massive ship plowed forward, her great guns silent, her decks lined with sailors gazing at the horizon. They knew the Americans would come, and the Americans were ready. U.S. intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, and more than 300 carrier-based aircraft were dispatched to intercept Yamato long before she could threaten the invasion at Okinawa. The final battle. Shortly after noon, the first waves of American aircraft appeared, specks in the sky that grew larger and louder as they approached. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with smoke and tracers. The roar of engines and the shriek of diving planes enveloped the ship. Bombs and torpedoes rained down. The first torpedoes struck her port side, causing the great ship to list. Damage control crews rushed to seal compartments and counterflood the starboard side, but more strikes followed. Dive bombers screamed downward, releasing their deadly cargo onto the armored decks. Explosions rocked the hull, tearing through steel, igniting fires, killing men at their stations. Wave after wave of aircraft descended upon Yamato. The ship fought back fiercely, her gunners shooting down several attackers, but the onslaught was overwhelming. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into her hull, and the list grew worse. By mid-afternoon, she was mortally wounded. The end of Yamato. At approximately 2:20 p.m., after enduring more than 10 torpedo hits and numerous bomb strikes, the great battleship could fight no longer. Her engines failed, her guns fell silent, and the order was given to abandon ship. But for most aboard, escape was impossible. Moments later, a massive explosion ripped through the vessel. Her forward magazines detonated, sending a colossal plume of smoke and fire rising 6 kilometers into the sky. Witnesses on distant ships described it as a volcanic eruption at sea. In that instant, Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was gone. She rolled onto her port side and sank beneath the waves, carrying with her over 3,000 of her crew. Barely 270 men survived, plucked from the sea by escorts or left adrift in the aftermath. The mighty battleship that had once symbolized the strength of a nation now lay silent on the floor of the East China Sea, a steel tomb for the thousands who had served aboard her. Cultural and historical legacy. The sinking of Yamato was more than the loss of a warship. For Japan, it was the end of an era. The battleship had been envisioned as the ultimate guardian of the nation, a steel embodiment of its strength and ambition. Her destruction, sudden and catastrophic, became a symbol of the futility of the old ways of war and the devastating cost of national pride. In Japanese memory, for decades after the war, Yamato lingered in the collective memory of the Japanese people. She was remembered not only as a weapon of war, but as a vessel of sacrifice, carrying thousands of young men to their deaths in a mission many believed was doomed from the start. In Japanese culture, Yamato became more than a ship. She became a metaphor for the nation itself. Proud, resilient, but ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond its control. In 1974, a new layer was added to her legend with the release of the anime series Space Battleship Yamato. In this reimagining, the battleship is resurrected as a futuristic starship, carrying humanity's last hope across the galaxy. For a new generation, the Yamato was no longer a relic of war, but a symbol of courage, endurance, and renewal. The series became a cultural phenomenon in Japan and abroad, ensuring that the ship's name would be remembered far beyond naval history. Literature and film. Historians, novelists, and filmmakers have continued to tell the story of Yamato. Books such as A Requiem for Battleship Yamato by Yoshida Mitsuru, one of the few survivors, brought personal voices to the tragedy. His memoir recounted the final voyage through the eyes of an officer who lived to see the ship go down, lending human depth to the legend of steel and fire. Japanese cinema also paid tribute. The 2005 film Otokotachi no Yamato, Men of the Yamato, dramatized her final mission, focusing on the young men who served aboard and the loved ones they left behind. The film was both a war drama and a requiem, a reminder that behind every rivet and every gun barrel were human lives and stories of sacrifice, rediscovery, and research. In 1985, an expedition discovered the wreck of Yamato, resting in two sections more than 1,000 feet below the surface of the East China Sea. Images of the shattered hull, her giant turrets overturned on the seabed, brought a haunting reality to the legend. Further surveys in the 1990s and 2000s revealed more details of her final moments, but also confirmed the extraordinary violence of her end. Today, parts of the Yamato story are preserved in museums, such as the Yamato Museum in Kure, where models, artifacts, and exhibits tell visitors about her history. For Japan, she is both a lesson and a symbol of technological brilliance, of the tragedy of war, and of the resilience of memory. Conclusion. The battleship. Yamato remains one of the most extraordinary warships ever built. Conceived in secrecy, forged in steel, and launched with the pride of an empire, she was a marvel of engineering and ambition. Yet her career was short, her victories few, and her end catastrophic. She represented the peak of battleship design, but also the obsolescence of the very idea she embodied. By the time she sailed into battle, the aircraft carrier had already eclipsed the battleship as the master of the seas. Her sinking was not only the end of a ship, but the end of an era. And yet, the Yamato endures. In memory, in culture, in history, she remains alive. She is remembered not simply for her size or her guns, but for what she symbolized: the hope and pride of a nation, the bravery of the men who served aboard her, and the tragic cost of war. When we speak her name today, we recall not just a warship, but a story, one of grandeur, sacrifice, and loss. a story that continues to echo across the decades, carried on the waves of history.